"This old woman only brings cheap casseroles and guilt to the table," Lauren said, lifting her wine glass as if she had just delivered the punchline of a harmless joke. The words hung in the air above the long oak dining table, heavy and unmistakable. A few nervous laughs followed. Someone cleared their throat. The chandelier cast a warm yellow glow over polished plates and folded linen napkins, but nothing in the room felt warm to Margaret Whitmore. She sat at the far end of the table, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if posture alone could hold together what had just cracked inside her. It was Sunday dinner, the kind she had hosted faithfully for over 30 years before arthritis in her knees, and the passing of her husband made the stairs too much and the kitchen too quiet. Now the dinners were held in Daniel and Lauren's renovated colonial home in suburban Ohio, a house with an open-concept kitchen and marble countertops Margaret had once helped pay for. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary still lingered in the air. The casserole dish she had carried in earlier that evening, wrapped carefully in a faded blue towel, sat half-empty near the center of the table. No one mentioned that it was the first dish to run out. Daniel stared down at his plate, cutting his chicken into precise squares as though it required intense concentration. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at his wife. He simply chewed and swallowed and reached for his water glass. Margaret noticed the way his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Across from her, Lauren smiled in a way that suggested she believed she had lightened the mood. "We're just teasing," she added lightly, brushing a strand of perfectly styled hair behind her ear. "You know how she is, always bringing something no one asked for." More laughter, softer this time, but still there. Margaret adjusted the napkin on her lap. She nodded once, almost politely, as if she were acknowledging a compliment instead of an insult. She had learned, over 72 years, that dignity often required silence. The dining room walls were lined with framed family photos, vacations in Florida, Christmas mornings in matching pajamas, Daniel's college graduation. In most of them, Margaret stood slightly off to the side, smiling, hands clasped, the steady presence behind every celebration. Tonight, she felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each second with mechanical indifference. Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, where the late autumn sky had already darkened into a deep navy blue. 8 months ago, she had sat beside Harold's hospital bed, holding his hand as the monitors beeped in slow, careful rhythm. He had squeezed her fingers and whispered, "You'll always be taken care of." She had believed him. She still did. But as Lauren's laughter faded and the conversation shifted to vacation plans Margaret had not been told about, she began to understand something else. Protection did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited. And Margaret Whitmore, though she said nothing at that table, was no longer simply listening. Margaret rinsed the empty casserole dish in the quiet of her small downstairs bathroom later that night, long after the dishes upstairs had been loaded into the dishwasher and the laughter had faded into the hum of a late television show. The guest suite she now occupied had once been Daniel's home office, a modest room with a narrow closet and a window that looked out onto the side yard where fallen maple leaves gathered against the fence. 8 months earlier, after Harold's funeral, Daniel had insisted it would be easier if she moved in with them. He had said it gently, with concern in his eyes, explaining that the old house with the steep staircase and the half-acre lawn would be too much for her to manage alone. Margaret had agreed because grief made everything feel heavier, including the thought of sleeping in a bed that suddenly seemed too large. At first, Lauren had been attentive in a careful, performative way. She labeled pantry shelves, reorganized Margaret's medications into a plastic weekly dispenser, and reminded her of doctor appointments as if Margaret had not managed her own calendar for decades. Over time, that attentiveness shifted. Margaret began noticing small adjustments that required no discussion, yet carried meaning. The thermostat was lowered without asking her preference. The family calendar on the refrigerator included soccer games and dinner reservations, but not her cardiology follow-up. A framed photograph of Harold that she had placed on the living room console quietly disappeared one afternoon and reappeared weeks later in her downstairs room, as though his memory belonged only in private. Daniel worked longer hours now. When he came home, he kissed Lauren on the cheek, tousled his son's hair, and nodded at his mother in passing. He rarely sat beside her anymore. Conversations happened around her rather than with her. Lauren handled the mail, sorting it into neat stacks before Margaret could even glance at the envelopes. Once, Margaret noticed a bank statement addressed to her being opened and placed on the kitchen counter. Lauren explained that she was just helping keep things organized. Margaret thanked her. She always thanked her. That evening, as she dried the casserole dish with a thin kitchen towel she had brought from her old house, Margaret replayed the dinner in her mind. The words themselves were not what lingered most. It was the ease with which they had been spoken, the casual certainty that no one would object. She set the dish carefully on the small dresser that doubled as a countertop in her room. The digital clock beside her bed read 10:43. The house above her creaked as someone walked across the hardwood floors. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed and folded her hands. She did not cry. Instead, she thought about documents, about signatures, about the quiet promises Harold had made. Silence, she had learned, was not surrender. Sometimes it was preparation. On Tuesday morning, Margaret woke before the rest of the house, as she often did, the pale light of early autumn filtering through the narrow window beside her bed. The digital clock read 6:15. Upstairs, the house was still, wrapped in the kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful but now felt conditional, as though it could be withdrawn at any moment. She dressed carefully in a soft gray cardigan and pressed slacks, the same way she had dressed when she used to volunteer at the public library twice a week. Routine mattered. It reminded her that she was still herself. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found Lauren already there, dressed in tailored workout clothes, scrolling through her phone while the coffee machine gurgled. Lauren looked up briefly. "Good morning," she said in a tone that suggested the greeting was optional. Margaret offered a gentle smile and reached for a mug from the cabinet. The cabinet shelves had been rearranged again. The mugs she preferred, simple white porcelain with thin blue rims, were now on the highest shelf, replaced at eye level by a matching set Lauren had purchased recently. Margaret paused only a second before reaching up on her toes to retrieve one. "I moved some things around," Lauren said without looking away from her screen. "It makes more sense this way." Margaret nodded. "Of course." She poured herself coffee, adding a measured splash of milk. Daniel entered moments later, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, already halfway into his workday in his mind. He kissed Lauren on the cheek and then glanced at his mother. "Morning, Mom." The words sounded rushed, unfinished. Margaret watched as Lauren handed Daniel a folder. "Do not forget to sign the refinance paperwork," she reminded him. "We need to finalize everything before the end of the month." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. Refinance. She had not been told about any refinancing. The house, after all, had been purchased partly with proceeds from the sale of her own home. Daniel flipped through the pages, nodding absently. "I will sign it tonight," he said. Margaret set her mug down carefully. "Is something changing with the mortgage?" she asked, her tone neutral, almost conversational. Lauren finally looked at her, offering a practiced smile. "It is just restructuring. Makes things cleaner. You do not need to worry about it." The phrase settled heavily between them. You do not need to worry about it. Margaret had balanced household budgets for 4 decades. She had navigated Harold's medical bills, insurance claims, property taxes on a half-acre lot, and college tuition payments measured in tens of thousands of dollars. Now she was being gently dismissed from a conversation about a house her savings had helped secure. Daniel shifted his weight. "It is just paperwork, Mom," he added, already reaching for his car keys. Within minutes, the front door closed behind him, and the garage door rumbled open and shut. Lauren gathered the folder and slid it into a leather tote. "I have a hair appointment at 10, she said casually. "If a package arrives, just leave it by the door." Margaret stood alone in the kitchen after she left, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. On the counter lay a single sheet of paper that had slipped from the folder, partially tucked beneath a placemat. Margaret did not rush. She did not even appear curious. She simply reached for the placemat to straighten it. Her eyes scanned the document in one steady sweep. Her name was not listed anywhere on the page. Margaret did not pick up the paper immediately. She finished straightening the placemat first, smoothing its edge against the granite countertop as though that had been her only intention. Then she lifted the loose sheet with steady fingers and read it from top to bottom. It was a draft agreement from a regional bank, outlining a refinancing structure that shifted ownership percentages and adjusted beneficiary designations. Daniel's name appeared in bold. Lauren's followed directly beneath it. There was a line where a third signature could have been added, but it was left blank. No mention of Margaret Whitmore anywhere in the text. She placed the paper back exactly where she had found it and took her coffee to the small breakfast nook by the window. Outside, the backyard lawn stretched in careful stripes from the last mowing. The maple tree near the fence already shedding orange leaves that collected in uneven piles. 8 months ago, when she signed the paperwork transferring proceeds from the sale of her own house, Daniel had assured her that everything would remain shared, that her contribution would be documented and protected. He had used phrases like temporary arrangement and family investment. Margaret remembered the afternoon clearly. They had sat at the dining table, sunlight pouring through the blinds, Harold's old fountain pen resting between her fingers. Lauren had leaned forward, speaking in a calm, measured tone about efficiency and simplification. Margaret had signed because she trusted her son, and because trust, once built over 45 years of motherhood, did not vanish overnight. Now she replayed that memory with a different lens. She noticed details she had ignored before. The way Lauren had answered questions directed at Daniel. The way Daniel had deferred, nodding rather than explaining. The way the conversation had moved quickly whenever Margaret paused too long. She set her mug down and folded her hands in her lap. Upstairs, a door closed softly. The house felt less like a home and more like a structure being rearranged around her. That afternoon, Margaret returned to her room and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were carefully organized folders, property tax records from her former house, copies of the original purchase agreement for this one, and a thin envelope labeled in Harold's handwriting. She traced the letters of her name on the envelope before opening it. Inside was a notarized document dated 3 months before his passing, outlining specific conditions tied to shared assets. She read each paragraph slowly, allowing the legal language to settle. There were clauses about respect, about cohabitation, about fiduciary responsibility. Harold had never raised his voice in his life, but he had always believed in preparation. Margaret closed the envelope and returned it to the chest. When Lauren came home later that afternoon, chatting brightly about salon appointments and upcoming holiday plans, Margaret greeted her with the same calm expression as always. She asked about the haircut. She complimented the color. She listened. Silence, she understood now, was no longer simply dignity. It was documentation in progress. The following Thursday, Margaret asked Daniel if he would have dinner with her alone the upcoming weekend. She kept her voice light, almost casual, as though she were requesting nothing more than company at a quiet restaurant. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before agreeing. "Sure, Mom," he said, glancing briefly toward Lauren, who stood at the kitchen island slicing vegetables with deliberate precision. "Saturday works." Lauren smiled, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. "That sounds nice," she said. "You two can catch up." Margaret noticed the way the knife tapped rhythmically against the cutting board, steady and controlled. On Saturday evening, Daniel drove Margaret to a small Italian restaurant 15 minutes away, a place with white tablecloths and soft instrumental music playing overhead. Margaret chose it because she and Harold had celebrated their 40th anniversary there. The booths were upholstered in deep red leather, and the scent of garlic and baked bread filled the air. They ordered pasta and iced tea. For a few minutes, they spoke about ordinary things, the weather turning colder, Daniel's workload, the grandchild's upcoming school project. Margaret listened carefully to the tone of her son's voice, searching for something familiar beneath the surface polish of adulthood. When their plates arrived, she folded her napkin neatly beside her glass. "Daniel," she began gently, "when you and Lauren refinanced the house, was there a reason my name was removed from the documents?" Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his eyes revealed that he understood. Margaret held his gaze steadily. "I saw the draft agreement on Tuesday. I did not mean to intrude. It was left on the counter." Daniel leaned back in his seat and exhaled slowly. "It is just easier this way," he said. "Lenders prefer fewer names on the title. It is not personal." Margaret nodded once. "And my contribution from the sale of my home?" she asked, her tone remaining even. Daniel shifted again. "It is still part of the equity. Nothing changes. You are living with us. Everything is shared." The phrase felt rehearsed. Margaret did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, She reached into her handbag and placed a folded copy of Harold's notarized addendum on the table between them. Your father anticipated adjustments, she said quietly. He included protections. Daniel glanced down at the document, his expression tightening as he scanned the highlighted sections. The clause was clear. Any alteration of shared assets without mutual consent could trigger a reallocation of ownership under a pre-existing trust. Daniel looked up slowly. Mom, that is extreme, he said. Lauren has done nothing wrong. Margaret studied her son's face, the same face she had once kissed goodnight when he was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Perhaps, she replied softly. But preparation is not accusation. The waiter approached to refill their glasses, unaware of the shift in atmosphere at the table. When they were alone again, Daniel folded the paper carefully and slid it back toward her. Let me talk to Lauren, he said. Margaret nodded. She did not press further. As they left the restaurant and stepped into the cool Ohio evening, the air crisp against her skin, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Not anger, not fear, clarity. The house she now lived in was not simply walls and mortgage payments. It was leverage, and she had just reminded her son that she understood exactly how it worked. Daniel did not bring up the restaurant conversation that night. When they returned to the house, Lauren was seated at the dining table with her laptop open, spreadsheets glowing against the dim overhead light. She looked up as they entered, her expression attentive but measured. How was dinner? She asked. Daniel loosened his tie and set his keys on the counter. Fine, he said too quickly. Margaret removed her coat and hung it carefully on the hallway rack. She noticed the way Lauren's eyes flickered between them, assessing tone rather than words. The evening passed in polite routine. The dishwasher hummed. The television murmured in the living room. Margaret excused herself early and returned to her room downstairs, closing the door with a soft click. The next morning, she rose before sunrise and prepared for church, selecting a navy dress and a strand of pearls Harold had given her on their 25th anniversary. She did not mention the addendum again. She did not need to. By Monday afternoon, the atmosphere in the house had shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Lauren's movements were quieter, more deliberate. Conversations paused when Margaret entered the room. Daniel avoided prolonged eye contact, offering small smiles that felt carefully constructed. Margaret observed everything without comment. That afternoon, she scheduled an appointment with Harold's former attorney, a man named Richard Callahan whose office sat above a small bakery downtown. The building smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee when she arrived on Wednesday. She carried a leather folder containing copies of the refinance draft and the original addendum. Richard greeted her with professional warmth, his gray hair neatly combed, his glasses resting low on his nose as he reviewed the documents. He read slowly, occasionally tapping the page with his pen. The clause is enforceable, he said at last. If ownership percentages were altered without your written consent, the trust can be activated immediately. Margaret listened without interruption. And what would that mean? She asked. Richard folded his hands. It would transfer controlling interest back to you, temporarily or permanently, depending on how you proceed. Margaret considered the words carefully. She did not appear triumphant. She appeared thoughtful. I do not wish to cause conflict, she said, but I will not be erased. Richard nodded. Preparation is not conflict, he replied. When Margaret returned home, Lauren was in the kitchen organizing mail into neat stacks. You were out? Lauren observed casually. Just an appointment, Margaret answered, placing her handbag on the side table. She moved through the house with steady calm, noting the polished countertops, the framed photographs, the subtle tension woven into the air. That evening, Daniel approached her downstairs door and knocked softly. When she opened it, he looked tired. Mom, he began. Lauren and I think it might be better if we revisit the paperwork together. Margaret stepped aside, inviting him in. The small room felt composed, orderly, like a space untouched by haste. She sat across from him, hands folded. I agree, she said gently. In that moment, Daniel understood something he had not fully grasped before. His mother had never been unaware. She had simply been patient. The paperwork meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the same small downtown office above the bakery, the scent of sugar and warm bread drifting faintly through the hallway as Margaret stepped out of the elevator beside Daniel and Lauren. The three of them entered Richard Callahan's office together, A quiet room lined with dark wood shelves and neatly labeled binders. Margaret wore a cream blazer and low heels, her posture straight, her expression composed. Daniel carried a leather folder. Lauren held her handbag close against her side. They sat across from Richard at a polished conference table, sunlight falling across the surface in clean rectangles. Richard greeted them professionally and opened the file containing the original agreements and the recent refinance draft. "We are here to ensure clarity," he began calmly. "The addendum signed by Harold Whitmore remains active and enforceable." Lauren nodded politely. "We understand," she said. There was no intention to exclude anyone. Margaret listened without interruption. Her hands rested lightly atop one another on the table. Richard continued, explaining that any structural change to ownership required unanimous written consent under the Trust's protective clause. He outlined how the controlling interest would automatically revert to Margaret if alterations proceeded without that consent. The language was clear, not dramatic, not threatening, simply precise. Daniel shifted in his seat. "We would like to amend the refinance paperwork," he said finally, "to reflect equal acknowledgement of initial contributions." Lauren's smile remained steady, but her eyes revealed calculation rather than ease. "Of course," she echoed softly. Richard slid a revised document across the table. This version listed Margaret Whitmore alongside Daniel and Lauren, acknowledging her financial contribution and granting her explicit authority in future structural decisions. Margaret read each line carefully. She did not rush. She adjusted her glasses once and then lowered them again. "This is acceptable," she said at last. Daniel signed first. Lauren followed, her pen moving smoothly across the paper. Margaret signed last, her signature firm and deliberate. The sound of the pen lifting from the page seemed to settle the room. Richard gathered the documents and placed them neatly into a folder. "Transparency prevents misunderstanding," he said evenly. Margaret rose from her chair and buttoned her blazer. She did not look at Lauren directly. She did not need to. As they exited the building and stepped into the cool afternoon air, the sky above Ohio was pale blue, the wind carrying the faint scent of approaching autumn rain. Daniel exhaled quietly. "I am glad we handled that," he said. Margaret offered a small nod. "So am I." Lauren walked slightly ahead, heels clicking against the sidewalk in measured rhythm. No one spoke during the drive home. The silence inside the car felt different now. Not fragile, structured. Margaret gazed out the window at the passing storefronts and turning leaves. Control had not been taken. It had simply been reaffirmed. And in that affirmation, something subtle but permanent had shifted within the walls of their home.